The night had a strange kind of hush to it, the sort that made even the rain sound like a secret being whispered. A lantern flickered inside the barn, faint and trembling, while outside the storm tore through the plains like a wounded thing. And through that darkness, a woman came running. Her name was Clara Wynne. She stumbled through the mud, her breath ragged, her hair soaked and plastered to her face. One arm clutched a torn satchel to her chest, the other slammed against the barn door until her knuckles bled. "I'm begging you," she gasped, her voice raw, half-choked by the wind. "Please, hurry up." Inside, a man stirred from the shadows, tall, built like he'd been carved from the same wood his house was made of. "Rhett Calloway." Folks in town said he didn't talk much since the fire that took his wife 3 winters ago. They said grief had turned him to stone. But when he opened that door and saw her standing there, rain running down her face like tears she hadn't earned, something softened in his stillness. He didn't ask questions. He just stepped aside. She crossed the threshold without a sound, shivering under the dim yellow light. The smell of hay and smoke wrapped around her like an old blanket. For a long moment, they just stood there, 2 strangers caught in the same silence. Then he nodded toward a corner near the stove. She sat trembling, clutching the satchel to her chest. He turned, pulled a blanket from a hook, and handed it to her. His voice was low when it finally came. "Storm'll pass by dawn." She nodded, her lips quivering. "Thank you, mister." "I'll go by morning." He didn't answer. Just set another log on the fire, the sparks lifting into the dim air like tiny ghosts. Outside, the thunder rolled away into distance. Inside, the only sound was the drip of rain from her dress onto the dusty floor. Earlier that same day, the whole town of Dry Creek had watched Clara Wynne fall from grace. She worked behind the curtain of the saloon, not on stage, not with the dancers, but with a needle and thread, stitching lace and mending rips, keeping the girls decent in their indecent world. She'd been saving for months, hoping to open a sewing corner of her own someday, but all it took was one drunk, one shove, one torn bodice, and every rumor she'd worked so hard to outrun came roaring back like wildfire through dry grass. The sheriff came stomping in that night, his voice hard as gravel. "He says you tempted him, Clara." She'd tried to speak, but shame froze her tongue. And when morning came, they made sure she was gone, her name dragged through every porch and parlor in town. Etta Mallory, the merchant's wife, had been the first to say it. "She's just like her mother was. Pretty enough to fool a man, foolish enough to believe he'll stay. By dusk, even the preacher's wife crossed the street to avoid her shadow. Then, when her small rented room caught fire that night, a lamp tipped, flames licking through the curtains. Clara didn't even try to save her things. She ran barefoot into the storm, clutching the satchel that held her only living, her sewing tools. Some thread and one folded handkerchief, stitched with her mother's initials. That's how she came to Rhett Calloway's door. The ranch was quiet, but for the crackle of the stove and the restless stomp of a horse in the stable. Rhett sat across from her, his face unreadable beneath the flicker of the flame. Clara tried not to look at him too long, but there was something about the way he carried stillness, like the air bent around him differently. His eyes weren't cruel, just distant, as if he'd been living with ghosts too long to fear the living anymore. When she finally spoke, her voice was fragile as glass. "I'll work for my keep. I can sew, mend things, just until I can head east." He didn't answer, but she saw his jaw move, the faintest nod. By the time sleep came, her blanket had dried stiff from the fire's warmth. She curled near the edge of the cot, listening to the sound of wind slipping through the boards. Her dreams smelled of smoke and regret, and when dawn broke, a pale silver spilling over the plains, she saw it, a small grave near the fence line, a rough wooden cross, a cluster of wildflowers that hadn't yet wilted. She didn't ask whose it was. Some things a woman just knows. Sheriff Boone rode up that morning, his horse kicking up dust and distrust. Clara stood outside, her shawl pulled tight, the cold biting her fingers. "Rhett," the sheriff called. "You got a woman hiding out here?" The rancher stepped out, calm as stone. "Not hiding, just passing through." Boone spit into the dirt. "Town don't like her kind. You take her in, you'll bring trouble to your door." Rhett's gaze flicked toward Clara, then back to the sheriff. "Town never gave me peace to start with." Boone shifted in his saddle, muttering something about decency. and rode off, his shape shrinking into the horizon. Clara stood still, her chest tightening. "I'll go," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to." But he cut her off, not with words, but by turning toward the barn. "Storm ruined the fence on the north side," he said. "Could use a hand with the mending." She blinked, uncertain. "You want me to stay?" He didn't answer, only kept walking, and that silence was all the permission she needed. Days turned into a rhythm. Quiet, wordless, steady, she swept the barn, cooked simple meals, stitched the rips in his shirts and the tears in his gloves. He worked the land from sunrise to dusk, returning only when the sky turned orange and the air smelled like dust and sweat. At first, he barely looked at her. But she noticed small changes. An extra loaf of bread left on the table, a folded blanket by her door. The fire kept burning longer than before. Sometimes he'd pass by while she was sewing, his footsteps heavy but unthreatening. Once she caught him glancing at her hands, rough from work, pricked with needle marks, and something unreadable passed through his eyes. Jonas, the orphan boy who brought supplies, started whispering in town that the woman in Rhett's barn was mending more than clothes. Etta Mallory made sure those whispers grew teeth. Clara heard them when she went to fetch water. Women turned their backs. Men stared too long. But every night she returned to the ranch, and there was peace in the sound of horses breathing, in the slow crackle of wood, in the way Rhett's quiet filled the air with something that wasn't judgment. One evening, she found a single apple placed on the stool by her cot. Clean, red, perfect. She held it in her hands for a long time, her eyes stinging, her throat tight with a feeling she couldn't name. She hadn't been given anything without strings in a long, long while. And as the night settled soft over the plains, the old soul narrator's voice would linger like smoke in the rafters. Sometimes grace don't come dressed in sermons or apologies. It comes quiet, like a man who don't turn you away when he could. Like the sound of rain easing after the storm. And so, in the silence between two wounded hearts, something began. Not love yet, not forgiveness, but the first small step toward both. The days stretched long and golden, stitched together by silence and the rustle of prairie wind. Clara's hands never stopped moving, thread through cloth, cloth through time. Her stitches were steady, a prayer in motion. She mended what she could of the world around her, shirts, saddle straps, torn hearts. Rhett Calloway spoke little still, but something in his eyes had softened, like thawing frost. One afternoon, while sweeping the old room where he rarely went, Clara found a cracked mirror leaning behind a chest. It caught a sliver of her reflection, smudged, small, half-hidden. Behind it, tucked between boards, was a letter, scorched along the edges. The paper crumbled like ash under her fingers. She read only a few lines before she stopped. "If I'd come sooner, maybe you'd still be here. Maybe I'd have said the things I kept inside." The ink had bled, the grief with it. It wasn't written for her, but it might as well have been. That night she sat by the fire long after he'd gone quiet, and with a trembling hand she stitched a handkerchief from spare linen. In blue thread she wrote only one line: "The living still deserve kindness." By morning she left it folded on the table beside his coffee tin. When he found it, he didn't move for a long while. The fire crackled, the wind shifted, and in that small gesture, thread and cloth and mercy, something inside him broke free from the ashes. The town couldn't stay quiet forever. Etta Mallory rode up one afternoon under the excuse of bringing flour, her lips already sharp with poison. She dismounted slow, her gloved hand resting on her hip. "Well now," she said, eyeing Clara sweeping the porch. "Seems a certain seamstress found herself quite the situation. Living out here with a man, no ring, no preacher? What's a body to think?" Clara froze. The broom hung limp in her hand. Before she could answer, Rhett stepped out from the barn. The sunlight hit his face, stern, weathered, calm as a drawn pistol. "You can think," he said quietly. "Whatever helps you sleep at night. But this woman's done more honest work here in a week than most folks do in a lifetime." Etta's face flushed, her mouth twisting like she'd bitten into something bitter. "I'll pray for you both," she hissed, climbing back onto her horse as she rode off. Rhett's voice followed her into the distance. "Do that. Maybe the Lord'll teach you what mercy feels like." That night the town was thick with talk. Some said Rhett had lost his mind. Some said Clara had bewitched him. And yet in the hush between those words, a new whisper began, the kind that couldn't be burned down by rumor, that maybe a man could stand beside a fallen woman and not fall himself. A week later, the wind carried a different smell, smoke again. But this time it wasn't memory. It was fire. It came just before dawn when the moon still hung like a silver coin over the ridge. Clara woke to the sound of horses screaming, the air thick and sharp. The barn was ablaze, flames climbing the beams faster than breath could follow. She ran barefoot through the dirt, shouting his name. "Rhett! Rhett!" He was already there, trying to cut the reins, coughing through the black haze. The heat was unbearable, the sound monstrous. She ran into the smoke, eyes burning, lungs searing.
"I'm begging you, hurry up!"
she screamed, yanking at a rope that trapped a panicked mare. Sparks bit her arms, her skirt caught ember, but she tore it free. Then the roof groaned, a sound that split the air. The beam above him cracked, falling. He went down under it. Clara's heart seized. She didn't think. She just moved. She crawled through the burning hay, grabbed his arm, and pulled with everything she had. Smoke clawed at her throat, tears streamed down her face. Her voice came hoarse and desperate. "Please, Rhett, don't you die on me." With one final pull, he came loose, coughing, heavy against her shoulder. They collapsed together in the dirt outside as the barn folded into itself, the fire roaring into the sky. When the dawn came, it found them blackened, gasping, alive. The fields glowed with ash and gold. He turned to her, eyes rimmed red, voice shaking for the first time she'd ever heard it. "You did what I couldn't," he said softly. "You came back for me." By noon, the whole town was gathered near the fence line. The fire had drawn them like moths, ready to feast on the next scandal. Etta was there, of course, lips tight, eyes hungry. Clara stood apart, face soot-streaked, hair tangled. She felt their stares like knives. Some muttered about sin, others about curses. She almost stepped back, ready to fade again into silence. But then Rhett moved. He walked through the crowd, slow and sure. His shirt was torn, his arm bandaged, but he carried himself with that same grave quiet that made even the wind pause. He stopped beside Clara, and then, before all of them, he did the unthinkable. He took off his hat. He took her burned hand in his. His thumb brushed over her bandaged skin like an oath. "This land," he said, voice carrying across the hushed yard, "is as much hers as mine now." Gasps rippled. No one spoke. Clara stared up at him, tears cutting clean paths down her soot-stained cheeks. He wasn't proposing. He was restoring, standing between her and every cruel whisper that ever tried to bury her. Sheriff Boone looked away. Etta's face fell blank. The world seemed to still, and then, slowly, the crowd began to drift off, one by one, leaving behind nothing but dust and silence. Weeks passed. The ranch rose again from ruin, boards new and shining in the sun. Clara sewed curtains this time, not rags. The laughter of the horses sounded like forgiveness. Jonas ran through the yard barefoot, carrying nails and hope in his small hands. Rhett worked alongside him, his silence softer now, his shadow no longer so heavy. Inside the cabin, above the mantel, he'd hung a small frame. Inside it, the smoke-stained handkerchief rested under glass. The words were nearly faded. The blue thread barely visible, but if you leaned close, you could still read them. The living still deserve kindness. When the evening came, the two of them sat on the porch, the prairie wind turning cool. Fireflies blinked between the grass. He didn't reach for her hand, and she didn't ask him to. Some things don't need to be spoken to be whole, and as the night deepened, that old, weathered voice, the voice of memory, seemed to rise again, carried by the hum of crickets and the sigh of earth cooling after fire. Some say love's a thunderclap. Others say it's a promise. But out here, where the wind forgets names and the stars forgive everything, love's just the courage to stay, to see someone, even when the world turns away. The fire inside the cabin flickered low, soft as breath. Two souls sat in its glow, no longer broken, just human. And the prairie held its peace at last.